sign the lease for 1 winter, then we both walk away. That's what Eleanor Whitfield said to me, and the strangest part is that she said it like she was ordering coffee. 1 winter, November to April. After that, we'd shake hands and pretend none of it ever happened. I should tell you up front that I'm not the kind of man anybody writes stories about. My name is Daniel Roy. I'm 43 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years fixing furnaces and water heaters, and the occasional frozen pipe for people across the east end of Ottawa. I drive a 2009 work van with a heater that takes 10 minutes to decide it feels like working, and I've got a daughter named Margot who is 9 and who is, without any exaggeration, the only thing I've ever gotten completely right. But before I get to the lease and the winter and the woman who tried to pay me to disappear, do me one small favor. If you've ever been the guy somebody calls when their house breaks but never once when their life is good, if you've ever been treated like a part that gets swapped out and forgotten, hit that subscribe button. This channel is for the people who keep the heat on while everybody else stays warm and never thinks about who made it that way. Go ahead, I'll be right here. Now let me start where it really started, which was the coldest week of January 2 years ago, on a service call to a house in Rockcliffe Park that was worth more than every house I'd ever lived in, put together, stacked end to end. Rockcliffe is where the old Ottawa money lives. Diplomats, deputy ministers, the families whose names are on hospital wings. I'd been there before, plenty of times, but always through the side door, always with my boots off and a drop cloth under my toolbox so I wouldn't scuff the floors that cost more than my van. You learn fast in my line of work that there's the front of a house and there's the back of a house, and a man like me lives his whole working life in the back of it. The call came in as a dead boiler, big old place, 4 floors, the kind of heating system that was state-of-the-art in 1986 and had been quietly dying ever since. The homeowner had passed, the dispatcher told me. The estate needed someone to keep the place from freezing through while the family sorted out what came next. Burst pipes in a heritage home in January is the kind of disaster that runs into 6 figures, so they wanted it handled, and they wanted somebody who wouldn't gawk or take photos or post about whose house it used to be. I pulled up to a wrought iron gate with a coat of frost on it an inch thick, and I waited in my van with the bad heater while somebody decided I was real. The man who'd died was Gordon Whitfield. If you follow business at all in this country, you'd know the name. He'd taken a single lumber operation up near Pembroke and built it, over 50 hard years, into one of the largest privately held forestry and building supply companies in Canada. He'd died at 79, in his own bed, in that house, and now the house sat full of 50 years of a man's life, waiting for someone to decide what it had all been worth. And the woman standing in the front hall when I came in through the back, the woman directing 2 estate appraisers with a tablet in her hand and a spine so straight it looked like it hurt. That was his daughter, Eleanor Whitfield, 39 years old, and according to every business page in the country that month, the brand new chief executive of everything her father had ever built. Here's the thing about how Eleanor Whitfield treated me that first day, and I lead with it because it's exactly where this whole story turns. She didn't treat me at all. She looked at a point about a foot above my head and told that point that the mechanical room was in the basement and that she trusted I could find it myself. I wasn't a person to her. I was a service that had arrived, the same as the plow that clears the driveway, the same as the salt truck. And honestly, I've had a whole lifetime of being looked through like that. It stopped stinging a long time ago. It's just the weather. You don't take the weather personally up here, or you'd never make it to spring. But I noticed it. You always notice it. You just stop letting it land. What changed her wasn't anything I said. It took 4 days, because that boiler was a nightmare, and it changed because of how I work. See, I'd done estate calls before. When somebody rich dies and the family needs, the house kept running while the lawyers fight. I'm the guy who keeps the pilot lit, and I'd learned something that the people who hire me almost never understand. When you go through a dead man's house, you are handling, with your bare hands, the most precious things on earth to somebody, and they are perfectly disguised as junk. On the second afternoon, I was down in that basement, and the appraisers had been through ahead of me, and they'd left a pile by the furnace marked for the dump. Old paint cans, a busted humidifier, a cardboard box gone soft with damp, and right on top of that box was a fishing rod, an old one. Wooden handle worn smooth and dark, in exactly the shape of a man's grip, the cork gone soft. A hand-tied fly still hooked into the cork like he'd just come in off the water and meant to head back out the next morning. I don't know why, but I couldn't put a fishing rod like that in a dump pile. A rod worn down to the shape of one specific hand is not garbage. It's 1,000 mornings on a lake somewhere. So I pulled it out, and I wiped it down with a rag, and I leaned it carefully in the corner of the stairwell where nobody would knock it over, and I went back to the boiler. I didn't think about it again. But Eleanor came down those basement stairs an hour later to check on the heat, and she stopped on the bottom step, and she went completely still. "Where did that come from?" she said. Not a question, really. Her voice had gone strange. "It was in the toss pile," I told her. "The fellows marked it for the dump. I figured somebody ought to look at it before it went. Looked like it mattered to whoever owned it." She didn't answer for a long moment. She just stood there on the bottom step, looking at that old rod like it had walked in off the lake on its own. "That was my father's," she said finally. "He had it 40 years. He taught me to cast with that rod on Golden Lake when I was 6, and then something in that careful locked-up face moved, just barely, just for a second. Everyone else just put it in a pile." "Most people didn't learn to fish off it," I said. "You did, so it's worth the minute." She looked at me then, actually looked. The way you'd look at a bird you'd been told was extinct. And then she nodded once and went back up the stairs without another word. But everything was different after that. She started seeing me, a man with a name stitched on his shirt. And though I had no idea at the time, she also started, very quietly, deciding something. The offer came on the 4th day, when the boiler was finally holding steady and I was packing up my tools. She asked me to come into the study, and she sat me down across the enormous desk that had been her father's, and she laid out the single strangest proposition of my entire life with the flat, even calm of a woman reading from a quarterly report. Her father, it turned out, had been worried about her. Gordon Whitfield, old school, self-made, the kind of man who'd never once said the soft thing out loud, had spent years watching his only daughter pour every waking hour into the company and never build a single thing of her own outside of it. No partner, no family, no life that wasn't the business, and near the end he'd done a thing he'd surely meant as love, and that landed like a bear trap. He'd written a condition into his will. To inherit full control of the holding company, the controlling shares, the chairmanship, all of it, Eleanor had to be married within 1 year of his death. If she wasn't, control would pass to a trust run by a faction of the board. And that faction, she told me in a flat voice that didn't quite cover the anger underneath, had every intention of breaking the company up and selling it for parts, and in doing it, quietly shutting down the family foundation her father had spent the back half of his life building. That foundation funded literacy programs in the North and bursaries for kids in mill towns who'd otherwise never see the inside of a university, from Pembroke clear up past Timmins. It was the thing Gordon Whitfield had been proudest of in the whole world, prouder of it than any of the money. He'd thought he was nudging his lonely daughter toward a life. Instead, he'd handed his own enemies a deadline and walked off the stage. "I'm not going to fall in love on a schedule to satisfy a clause in a will," she said. "That's absurd, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. But I can satisfy it. A real legal marriage, entered in good faith, kept up for the 6 months the clause requires, and then dissolved quietly the moment the review clears. What I need is a husband who's discreet, decent enough that my staff and the lawyers won't smell a fraud, who has no agenda of his own, and who genuinely needs the one thing I can offer in exchange." And then she named a number. I'm not going to tell you the number, but I'll tell you it was the kind of number that would change Margot's whole life and mine, permanently, from that day on. I want to be honest about that money, because I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'm above it. I'm a furnace tech, with a van that's dying and a 9-year-old whose entire future is balanced on a man with a bad back and almost nothing in the bank. That number meant Margot would never have to worry. Not about university, not about a roof, not about anything. It meant a real house instead of the top half of a duplex on Donald Street. It meant that if my back finally gave out tomorrow, that girl would still land soft. A man raising a kid alone doesn't get to be too proud to at least hear a number like that out. You owe the kid that much. But I'll be honest that I almost said no anyway, right there, because the whole thing felt like a lie wearing a good suit. I lost Margot's mother 4 years ago. Cancer. Fast, the kind where you go from a strange phone call to a funeral in 11 weeks. I won't drag you through it. What matters is that on the worst day of my life, I made myself a quiet promise that whatever else happened, I'd live a life I could one day explain to my daughter out loud, without ever once having to look at the floor while I did it. What tipped me was something Eleanor said when she saw me hesitating. The chief executive mask slipped for just a second, and underneath it was something tired and human. "I'm not asking you to lie to anyone who actually matters to you," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to help me stop a man's whole life's work from being torn apart by people who never built a single thing themselves. That's all this is, underneath the paperwork. My father would have hated every part of this arrangement. But he, of all people, would have understood it. So I signed. I told Margot we were going to stay at a friend's really big house for the winter, which wasn't a lie, exactly, if you held it at the right angle. Eleanor, to her credit, had genuinely not factored a 9-year-old into her clean little transaction, and I got to watch her realize it in real time on move-in day, the slow dawning on her face as a small girl in a purple toque walked into the middle of that echoing front hall, looked all the way up at the chandelier, and asked, dead serious, whether the house had Wi-Fi. I braced myself. I figured she'd be cold about it, treat the kid as a variable that didn't belong in a clean equation. Instead, she crouched down, stiff and awkward, like a woman who'd genuinely never done it before and wasn't sure of the mechanics, and she said, "The Wi-Fi password is taped inside the kitchen cupboard, and there are 11 empty bedrooms upstairs. Would you like to go pick whichever one you want as yours?" And Margot, who has not the faintest idea that some people are billionaires and some people fix their furnaces, and there's supposed to be a wall between the two, just reached up, took Eleanor Whitfield's hand, and went off up the stairs to pick out a room. And I stood there alone in that big cold hall and felt the first crack run straight through my certainty that this was nothing but a transaction. I'll be straight with you about those 6 months, because the truth of what happened is so much better than whatever you're bracing for. For a long while, it really was just a contract. We were polite roommates with a shared legal document and an end date. She worked 16-hour days saving her father's company from the wolves on her own board. I kept my service calls running the whole time, partly because I was not about to become some kept man in a rich woman's house, and partly because I knew with total certainty I was going to need that work to still be there waiting for me when this was done. We passed each other in long hallways. We performed a marriage convincingly for the exact handful of people who needed to see it. A foundation gala here, a photo at a ribbon cutting there, one good smiling picture aimed at precisely the right pair of eyes. It was strange and it was hollow and it was mostly, honestly, fine. A job is a job. What I hadn't accounted for, what neither of us had accounted for, with all her lawyers and all my hard-won caution, was Margot. A little girl who loses her mother at 5 becomes a kind of homing device, finely tuned and always quietly searching for one particular thing. And Margot found that thing, of all the unlikely places, in Eleanor Whitfield. It started small. Margot took to waiting up at night, fighting sleep, just to say goodnight to her. And Eleanor, who I'm fairly sure had never once in her adult life been needed by another person in a way that had nothing to do with money or leverage, had no idea what to do with a 9-year-old stubbornly staying awake to say goodnight. So she did the only thing you actually can do in the face of that. She showed up. She started coming home earlier without ever announcing why. She started reading the bedtime chapter herself on the nights I had a late call-out in Orléans. I came home one evening, dead tired, snow melting off my boots, and found the chief executive of a forestry empire sitting cross-legged on the floor of a kid's bedroom, being patiently and very sternly corrected on the proper way to braid the yarn hair of a doll named Beatrice, and taking the instruction with complete frowning seriousness, like it was a board presentation. And the woman who'd held her grief at gunpoint, who'd clamped herself shut so nothing could get in or out, started, slowly, and I don't think entirely with her own permission, to thaw. Because you simply cannot stay frozen solid around a child who loves you that easily, with no agenda, who doesn't know or care what your share price did today. Margot cracked Eleanor open the exact same way she'd cracked me open 4 years before, in the front seat of a work van in a hospital parking lot. Kids do that. It's their one great superpower, and they don't even know they have it. And then there was Eleanor and me. Somewhere in those months, the performing for other people quietly stopped being only performance. We started talking late, after Margot was finally asleep, really talking, the way you only seem to manage standing in a dark kitchen at midnight, with the rest of the world gone quiet. She told me about her father, the man whose fishing rod I'd pulled out of the dump pile, who'd been brilliant and impossible, and who'd loved her in a language she'd spent her whole life straining to translate and never quite managing. I told her about Margot's mother, and the 11 weeks, and the nightmares, and the parking lots. We were, I slowly understood, two people who'd both lost the one person who'd made them who they were, and who were both holding that loss at gunpoint so it couldn't move, and we recognized each other across that dark kitchen the way you recognize someone speaking your own language in a country a long way from home. That's the one thing no lawyer alive can write into a contract. Recognition. It just happens to you, or it doesn't. But here's what kept the whole thing from tipping over into a fairy tale, and it's the part I'm proudest of. I never once let myself forget the date. Day 180 sat in the middle of my chest like a swallowed stone the entire time. Cold, heavy, always there, because I'd been somebody's obligation once before, a long time ago, before Margot, before any of this. I won't drag you through that either, but I'd spent years being a man another person stayed with out of duty, instead of any real want, and I knew from the inside exactly what that slow poison does to a soul. And now I had a little girl whose whole heart was visibly, daily, wrapping itself tighter around a woman who'd signed a legal document promising to leave us both on a specific date. I lay awake more nights than I'll ever admit, sick with the fear that I was standing by and letting Margot pour her love into someone contractually obligated to vanish, that I was, with my own two hands, setting my girl up to lose a second mother. So as the days ticked down, I did the responsible thing, the thing that cost me more than I let on. I started gently getting Margot ready for the two of us to move back into our own place, and I started pulling myself back too, putting the wall up again, brick by brick, before the date could come and knock it down for me. Because I'd 1,000 times rather break my own heart slowly, on my own terms, than stand there and have it broken for me on a lawyer's calendar. Eleanor noticed me doing it, of course she did. She noticed everything, but she didn't say a word. The clause was satisfied. The company was saved. The foundation was secure, funded, untouchable. Every last thing the contract had ever been for had worked exactly as designed. There was nothing left to do but quietly carry out that final sentence on page 9. Which brings me to the second to last day. I was up in the room that had become Margot's, packing her small things into the same kind of boxes I'd hauled for strangers 100 times, except these particular boxes were shaking, just slightly, in my hands. Margot was at school. The next morning we were leaving for good, and then Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She was supposed to be downtown. It was the middle of a workday. She wasn't downtown. She was standing in the doorway of the room where I was packing up the belongings of the little girl she'd taught to braid a doll's hair, and she didn't say anything at all for a long, long time. She just watched my hands move. And then this woman, this chief executive who closed 9-figure deals without blinking, who I'd never once in 6 months heard ask a single soul for a single thing, said in a voice I'd never heard come out of her before, low and unsteady and stripped of all its armor, "Don't go." I kept wrapping the small running shoe in my hands. I didn't trust myself to look up at her. I knew if I looked up, I was finished. "Contract's done tomorrow," I said to the shoe. "It worked, all of it. You're safe. The company's safe. The foundation's safe. That was the whole deal." "I'm not talking about the contract." Her voice broke clean in half on the word. "Daniel, look at me. I'm asking you. I'm asking you to stay, both of you. Not for the clause. The clause is finished. I'm asking because." And she stopped dead because the words she was reaching for were words she had genuinely never said out loud in her whole life and had no practice forming. "Because I don't want you to go. I don't want her to go. I can't picture this house quiet again." And here's where I did the single hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than signing that contract. Harder than the packing. Harder than the parking lot. Because every cell in my body was screaming at me to drop that little shoe and cross the room in 2 steps and say yes. Yes, of course, yes. But I had a 9-year-old girl's entire heart sitting in my open hands, and I had my own hard, ugly, hard-won knowledge of exactly what it does to a person to be stayed with for the wrong reasons. And I owed both of those things the truth before I owed anybody a happy ending. I set the shoe down on the bed. I stood up straight, and I said, "No, not like this." She flinched like I'd struck her. "Listen to me," I said, "all the way to the end, because this matters more than anything I've ever said to anyone. I won't stay as a contract. I won't stay as the next convenient arrangement, as the thing that's easier than being alone, as the warm body that makes a big empty house feel a little less empty at night. I have been somebody's obligation before, Eleanor. I've been the man somebody kept out of duty instead of wanting, and it hollowed me out till there was nearly nothing left. And I swore I'd never be that again, and I will sure as hell never let Margot be the glue for somebody's loneliness. That girl has already lost one mother. I am not going to hand her a second one who's staying because the house feels too big, and then stand back and watch it fall apart a year from now when the quiet stops scaring you and the plain hard truth of a furnace tech and a billionaire finally sets all the way in." She was crying now, openly, silently, this woman who held her grief at gunpoint, the tears just running down her face, and I didn't do a single thing to stop them. "So I need you to do something you've never done," I said, and I made my voice gentle because the hard part was over. "I need you to stop being a CEO making a smart move to keep an asset from walking out the door. I need you to be a person, just a person, standing in a doorway, and I need you to tell me, plainly, with no clause and no money and no company attached to any of it, because all of that is safe now and none of it is in this room. I need you to tell me what you actually want. Not what's smart, not what solves the problem, what you want. And if it's real, if what you want is us, me and Margot, as your actual family, freely, because you choose it and not because you're frightened of the silence, then you say that out loud, in your own words. And if you can, then I promise you I'm not going anywhere, not ever. But you have to say the true thing first, because we are not a transaction, and I am all the way done being one, for anybody, for the rest of my life." And Eleanor Whitfield, who could command a hostile boardroom into silence, who could stare down a takeover without her pulse changing, stood in that doorway and did the bravest thing I have ever watched another human being do. She stopped performing. The CEO just slid off her shoulders like a coat dropping to the floor, and what was left standing there was a woman who'd lost her father and stumbled, entirely by accident, inside the four walls of a cold business contract, onto the exact family she'd spent her whole armored life too afraid to go looking for. "I love you," she said. "Both of you. Not the arrangement, you. I have been alone my whole life in a way all the money only ever made worse, and I didn't even know it until a man pulled my father's fishing rod out of a garbage pile because he thought it mattered. And a little girl sat me down on the floor and taught me to braid a doll's hair. I don't want this house quiet again. I don't want to go back to who I was before the two of you walked into that front hall. I'm not asking you to stay for a clause. The clause is dead. I'm asking because I can't picture my life anymore without the both of you in it, and that scares me more than losing the whole company ever could. That's the true thing. That's what I want. You. Please, please stay." So I stayed. Now, I told you at the start, this isn't a fairy tale, and I meant it, even here, even at the good part. We didn't ride off into any sunset. We did it the slow way, the real way, the grown-up way. We tore up what was left of that contract together over the kitchen sink. I kept my business, every bit of it, because it's mine and it's honest, and because Margot's is going to grow up watching a man who works for his living, not a kept one. We did the kind of counseling two guarded, grief-scared people genuinely need before they have any business fusing two broken families into one whole one. We took it one true day at a time, and some of those days were hard, and we kept going. Eleanor and I got married again a little over a year later. A real one this time, small, no lawyers in the room, out at a cabin on Golden Lake where her father had taught her to cast, with Margot standing up front holding the rings and Beatrice the doll in formal attendance on a chair of her own. The first marriage was on paper. The second one was on purpose. That's the whole difference, right there, and it's the only difference that's ever mattered. I want to say one last thing about the money, because I know it's been sitting in the back of your mind this whole time. I never took the payout, not $1. When we made the thing real, I told Eleanor I'd marry her gladly, but that I'd never cash a single check for it. Because the moment money gets involved, you never again get to be completely sure, and I'd watched, up close, for 6 months, exactly what that uncertainty had done to her whole life. Every kind word ever offered to her suspected of being an angle. Every person who got close quietly checked for a price tag. I was not going to be one more of those, not even a well-paid one, so I kept my van and I kept my business and I kept my own income, and we built a life where I'm her husband and her equal and emphatically not her employee. She fought me on it, hard. I won. It's the only argument I've ever won against that woman, and I've come to think she let me win it on purpose, because my turning down the money was the one thing on earth that could finally prove to her I'd never once been in it for the number. There's a version of that afternoon where I drop the shoe the second she asks, and cross the room, and just say yes and take the easy, beautiful, golden thing. And maybe it even works out fine, but there's no version of that day where I do that and also get to know, all the way down to the floor of myself, that she chose us as people and not as a problem she was solving. That Margot's second mother stayed in this house because she genuinely wanted to, and not because the rooms felt too big without us in them. I picked the true thing. I'd pick it every single time. So let me ask you just one thing before you go. Eleanor spent her whole life so heavily armored she nearly missed the only family she ever actually wanted, because to her, needing people felt like weakness and asking for them out loud felt like defeat. And it took losing everything and standing undone in a doorway for her to finally say one true thing without a contract wrapped around it to keep it safe. So here's what I honestly want to know from you tonight. When was the last time you said the true thing? The scary one, the bare one, the one with no safety around it, to a person you were afraid to need? Tell me about it down in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'd genuinely love to know. And if this story got to you, if you believe, like I've come to believe all the way down, that the bravest thing a guarded person can ever do is drop the armor and just say plainly what they want, then do me that one small favor. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Leave a like so the next person can find their way here. And I'll see you in the next one. Trust me, it's a good one. I've thought a lot about why it all turned out the way it did, and the more I sit with it, the more I'm convinced none of it was luck. The day I pulled Gordon Whitfield's fishing rod out of that dump pile, I wasn't trying to win anyone over. I just couldn't bring myself to throw away a thing that had been loved for 40 years. But that one small choice, made when nobody was watching and nobody would have known the difference, was the hinge the whole rest of my life swung on. That's the part people miss. We think the big moments announce themselves. They almost never do. They show up disguised as a quiet decision to do the decent thing when the lazy thing was right there and easier. Eleanor didn't fall for me because I was charming or rich or any of the things the world tells you matter. She started seeing me because I treated her father's worn-out tackle like it mattered, and she stayed because I refused to let her settle for a version of love that was really just fear of an empty house. Those two things came from the same place in me, and I think that place is just the habit of asking what's right and then actually doing it, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. Turning down that money on the second-to-last day nearly killed me. I had a daughter and a dying van and almost nothing in the bank. But I'd learned the hard way that the second you let the easy thing override the true thing, you start becoming a man you can't explain to your own kid. If I could hand Margot one thing to carry through her whole life, it wouldn't be the house or the security or any of it. It'd be the understanding that a steady character is built in private, in the small, invisible moments, long before any test ever arrives, and it'd be the clear eyes to tell the difference between what's smart and what's true, because they are not the same thing, and the world will spend your whole life trying to convince you they are. And it'd be the backbone to hold the line when holding it hurts, when every easy exit is lit up and waving you toward it. Eleanor had the brains and the success in spades. What nearly cost her everything was that she'd armored herself so completely, she almost couldn't say one honest sentence out loud. It took standing undone in a doorway, stripped of the company and the claws and all of it, for her to find the courage to just be a person and ask for what she wanted. So I'll leave you with the thing I keep coming back to. The life I have now, the one with a kid who has a mom again, came from refusing the shortcut. Every single time the shortcut showed up, I turned it down, and every single time, it gave me back something the shortcut never could have. The true thing is almost always the hard thing first. Pick it anyway. It's the only choice I've never once regretted.